Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. Today, my guest is former DEA Special Agent Rockwell Herron, and today with Rockwell, we'll talk about something that is very important these days, that is fentanyl, the crisis that is causing a lot of deaths in the United States, and it's a very complex and new topic to discuss. Therefore, I think it's also very interesting to cover on this channel. Thanks for your time, Rockwell. Thanks for joining me today.
No, I'm very happy to be here talking to you.
Well, before we start discussing fentanyl and the crisis, would you like to tell me and my viewers something about yourself, who you are, whatever you feel is relevant before we get into the topic?
Yeah, certainly. So my name is Rocky Herron. I was a DEA Special Agent for the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States from 1990 to 2021. And I worked mostly in San Diego, California, where I was born, which borders with Tijuana, Mexico. It's a very, very busy drug trafficking region. And then for 6 years, I worked in Bolivia from 1998 to 2004. So I spent 31 years in the DEA investigating drug crime at the street level, at the national level, and at the international level. And then about 18 years ago, I discovered something unfortunate. I discovered that the young people I was arresting for dealing drugs who were in addiction had never been warned about drug abuse in school. And I discovered my own children who were in school weren't receiving any education about drug abuse. So for the last 18 years, when I was with DEA and now I'm retired, I've dedicated myself to teaching children as much as I can about the consequences of drug abuse in the individual, the community, the country, and the rest of the world.
Well, but this fentanyl thing is very big in the news every day, pretty much. But how did it start? Because at the very beginning, it was a legal medication. It was a painkiller for backaches or something like that. So how did it start?
Well, it still is a legal medication. The legal fentanyl is a miracle drug, and it's used every day in the United States in emergency care. Ambulances, all paramedics and ambulances all carry and use fentanyl. It's used in cancer care. It's used in burn care. Fentanyl is a very, very powerful and fast-acting painkiller. It takes very little to protect the patient, and that's why it's such a useful drug. You don't have to give them a heavy dose to get good coverage. But the problem we're dealing with in the United States is not the legal fentanyl, it's the illegal, clandestinely manufactured fentanyl. And the problem we have today, we can trace back to 1995, because in 1995, a medicine was licensed in the United States called OxyContin. And it was a pure form of the drug oxycodone. And very quickly, people discovered that if you crushed up the pill and smoked it or snorted it, you got a heroin-like high. So for many, many years in this country, OxyContin pushed heavy opioid abuse out into our population and across the country. But OxyContin was very expensive and difficult to get. And in about 2000, in the early 2000 teens, the Mexican drug cartels saw how much Americans were spending on abusing legitimate prescription drugs that they decided to get in the business. So the Mexican drug cartels began to falsify and produce counterfeit pills in Mexico that looked like they came from pharmacies in the United States. And then they would sell these and tell people they were OxyContin, and they were making huge amounts of money. And initially, these pills contained heroin. So the person buying the pill thought they were getting OxyContin, but they were getting heroin. Well, then the cartels realized that if they could substitute heroin with fentanyl, they could make more money, because fentanyl is very inexpensive to produce. It has a heroin-like high, and it takes very little to get that high. So in about 2015, we saw the beginning of the current problem, which is huge quantities of clandestinely manufactured fentanyl coming across the border into the American population.
Well, but as you said, this is a pretty recent phenomenon because it started to be that big and that bad like 10 years ago.
Yes.
How has it evolved over time? Because if I think about it, like 10 years ago, probably heroin was bigger. So is fentanyl replacing other drugs, or is being consumed alongside them?
Well, fentanyl is the most profitable drug ever produced. Um, they can produce a dose of fentanyl for just a few pennies. And the drug trafficking business is a business model. It's a business. So the cheaper you can make your product, right? And if you can sustain the price on the street, then you have greater profits. So it's the profit margin of fentanyl that really created this problem. And fentanyl is a synthetic drug, meaning it's made from completely industrial chemicals. Heroin is a very complicated and expensive drug to produce. You have to have thousands of acres of poppy cultivation. You have farmers harvesting the poppy, and they move the poppy, and they extract the gum from the poppy, and they use chemicals at every stage. And it's a very complicated production process. Fentanyl can be produced in a warehouse or a basement. So the cartels now have very small, physically small laboratories producing massive amounts of fentanyl with a very, very small footprint.
But how does a person start being addicted to fentanyl? Because at a certain point, someone has to feel a need to consume this substance and then he gets addicted. How does it start usually?
Well, this is a very important question, right? We have a large drug consuming culture in the United States. And so my work now, all of my work now is fighting the demand for drugs, pushing back against the culture in the United States that promotes drug use. So people, when they're using drugs, aren't starting to use it intending to get addicted to something. They're not intending to get an overdose. They're seeking a substance, a legitimate substance, alcohol, the most dangerous drug ever invented, or a pharmaceutical medicine to meet some need inside them, or the street drugs. And so they start using the pharmaceutical pills. And this is what's so scary about fentanyl. People started buying pills that look like they came from a pharmacy. They look safe. They don't look dangerous. When I was young, heroin was famous as being a very nasty, dangerous drug to use. People used it with dirty needles. It was a very unpleasant way to use a drug. Well, when heroin started showing up in the pills, first OxyContin and then heroin and now fentanyl, the pills, it doesn't look scary. And people take the pill and they put it on a piece of foil and they heat it up and they inhale the vapor. So they're using the drug to get high. And in my argument is that most of the people who start using it are doing it to self-medicate. They have internal traumas, internal pains that they believe they can mitigate through using the substances. And they don't understand that the potency of fentanyl is so strong that some people have told me they felt addicted the first time they used it. Now, you can't get chemically addicted, medically addicted to something the first time you use it. But I've met many people over the years who told me that the first time they smoked heroin or OxyContin or fentanyl, they felt they were going to do it again. And if they do it again long enough, then they do also become medically addicted. So people start using it to self-medicate. They discover at some point that it's almost impossible to stop, and they're trapped in this cycle of addiction.
Also, because I watched a documentary, of course, an Italian documentary a few days ago, and they showed that the lethal dose is so small that you almost don't see it. Like you need a very small quantity to get addicted. To get
It takes,
addicted.
they have, it's called an LD50. So there's a dose that will kill 50% of the people who take it. And that's presumed to be 2 milligrams of fentanyl, which is a very tiny amount. But that's 2 milligrams of pure fentanyl. And we're not seeing the distribution of pure fentanyl on the streets. It's most of it's coming in Mexico, pressed into pills, or it's pressed into a powder that has 10% or 5% fentanyl. So the potency numbers and the lethality numbers get a little confusing because if the police sees a kilogram of fentanyl on the street, they're not seizing a kilogram of pure fentanyl. A kilogram of pure fentanyl could, in fact, kill millions of people. But the fentanyl that we're seizing in law enforcement is a very low potency. It's dangerous, and it's certainly dangerous to the people that use it, but it's not nearly as dangerous as the pure fentanyl would be.
Who are the most likely victims? Because if I think about drug consumption, of course, the first image that comes to our minds would be slums, would be usual drug addicts that you can even find. I've been to LA twice in the recent years, and there are homeless guys and even people on drugs pretty much everywhere, all around the city. Is that the case for fentanyl as well? Are those people the most likely victims?
Well, it depends, right? So there's a concept called a naive user. And a naive user is someone who's never been exposed to a drug. So if I've been using opioids, prescription opioids or heroin or other drugs, and I try fentanyl, my body is going to be more resistant because my body is accustomed to using opioids. If you've never tried an opioid and you take the same dose of fentanyl that I take, perhaps you can have a very negative consequence, an overdose or a really bad outcome. So for me, I work with kids. 22 and younger. And I worry about those kids because those kids can take what is an average dose of fentanyl that might not be harmful to someone who uses fentanyl regularly, but it could have a very dangerous consequence in that young person. The people who use fentanyl over time run the risk of getting that hot dose, right? So they're used to taking a certain amount of fentanyl that they think is in the pill or the powder, but then they get a pill or a powder that has a much higher concentration and they succumb to an overdose. There's no quality control in the production. It's being made in very unprofessional laboratories by the drug gangs in Mexico. So it's very terrifying. As someone who's trying to warn the population, literally every pill that someone takes could be deadly. And DEA over the years has published statistics saying, well, 50% of the pills are deadly or 80% of the pills are deadly. When I teach, I say they're all potentially deadly because the pill that I might take and be fine, I weigh almost 200 pounds. If a 13-year-old girl took that pill, she might have a fatal consequence. So it's very difficult when you want to quantify precisely how much could harm, an average human.
So how big is the phenomenon? This is what I think people fail to understand. Because I remember, for instance, watching a documentary like 10 years ago or so saying that in Chicago, the deaths caused by gun violence was pretty much the same as Iraq, which is a war zone. So how big is fentanyl if we compare it to gun violence or with car accidents in terms of death rates?
Oh, it's massive. It's 10 times bigger. It's 10 times bigger. I don't have the
Wow.
latest figures for guns or cars, but I do know, for example, that in the United States, we have about 10,000 deaths a year from driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. 10,000 a year. We consider that to be a significant problem. Several years ago, we got to almost 10,000 a month dying from drugs. Last year, the overdose numbers dropped under 100,000. I think we're at about 98,000 a year dying from drug overdose. And I'm glad the numbers went down, but it's still hard to celebrate almost 100,000 people a year dying from drugs. But that works out to something over 250 people a day, which would be the equivalent of a Boeing 737 crashing every day in this country and killing everybody on board. And many people who teach the warnings about fentanyl, we use that statistic because if we had a commercial airliner crashing and killing the entire population every day, we would pay attention. We would be upset. We would think it's a big problem. But we have somehow assimilated, as Americans, we've somehow assimilated that 100,000 people dying every year is normal or unchangeable or not something we should really start talking a lot about.
What is the role of organized crime here? So let me explain what I have in my mind, and then you tell me if this is correct or not. I assume that we have cartels sneaking this drug into the United States, probably from the southern border, Mexican cartels that would be. And then I think that the delivery to the final users would be up to the street gangs. I don't know if that's correct or if this is just my imagination.
No, that's fundamentally correct. I mean, most of the fentanyl that we're seizing, that law enforcement is capturing in the United States, does come from Mexico. That I'm going to say 90%. But there is a percent still coming in from Canada. It's not anywhere near the same volume, but there's still fentanyl
Mhm.
coming in from Canada. And then there are still people who can order either fentanyl or the chemicals from China and produce it within the United States. But the vast majority today is produced by the drug gangs in Mexico. It floods into our country pressed into pills that look like they're from a pharmacy or powdered bricks. And the first investigation I worked was 4,000 pills. In 2016, my office in San Diego, we seized 4,000 fentanyl pills, and we thought we were making a difference. And today, they're routinely seizing 1 million pills at the
Are
border.
you
So the shipments are just gigantic.
are you telling me that there are drug cartels in Canada as well? That was unexpected.
Well, I'm not going to call them cartels, but they're
Okay.
just yesterday, a Canadian was convicted in the United States for many kilos of fentanyl that were charged against him. So yes, it's nothing like what comes in from Mexico, but there is production because it's not complicated to make fentanyl. If you have the formula and you get access to the chemicals, it's not difficult to produce it. And the profit margins are astronomical. So there is a financial incentive for people to make it. But it's interesting when we talk about how much of the drug gets seized, because that's all we know about. Now, I spent 9 years working directly on the border with Mexico. And when I used to teach, I would say that on our best day, we would catch 10%, right? On our best day in DEA and customs, we catch 10% of the drugs. Well, recently I met a man who ran Chicago for Chapo Guzman,
Mhm.
and he went to prison for 14 years. and he knows what he's talking about. And I told him that I was teaching that it was 10%. And he goes, Rocky, you're way off. I go, what do you mean? He goes, it's 5. He goes, my brother and I tried to import 60,000 kilos of cocaine into Chicago from Mexico. We lost 5%. So what that means to me is for every time we see a drug seizure of fentanyl at the border of 1 million pills or 500 kilos, I ask people to think about the 10 to 20 times as much that didn't get caught, that flooded into our country. So nobody has a true idea of how much is coming in the US.
And then how do people buy it? I think it's from gangsters
Well,
down the street.
but the Mexican drug cartels have distribution networks across the United States. So they smuggle the drug into the United States in bulk quantities, and then they break it up, and the cartels themselves distribute it out across America. And then at a certain point, it does down into the local drug dealers and the local street gangs, who are the ones who distribute it at the street level. The fake fentanyl pills, when they first showed up, people were charging the same price as a legitimate pharmaceutical because people didn't know they were fakes. And over the last 10 years, the price has dropped dramatically. And I have old informants for the DEA who tell me that they can buy fentanyl pills for 50 cents each wholesale.
Wow.
And so they can turn around and sell that pill for $2 or $3, and they're making a huge profit margin. Per pill is not very much, but when you add it up over time, there's a massive profit margin. And of course, for the producers, it only costs them a few cents to make that pill. So even if they're selling that pill 50 cents, they're still making an incredible profit over what it costs to produce it.
Well, this makes it even worse instead of making it better because it means that everybody can buy it. Because
Correct.
everyone, even a kid going to grammar school, probably has $2 in his pocket.
Yes, and the price has dropped so much that I have heard anecdotally that drug dealers will give it out. It's like a pharmaceutical company. The drug dealers will go to a gathering or they'll go to a party and they'll hand it out for free as a marketing service because they know every number of people that they get to try it, a certain percentage are going to go, oh, I want more of that. So we're at a point now where the most dangerous drug ever invented, the one that could kill your child or create a lifetime of addiction, could be given to them for free or for just a handful of dollars.
What is the role here of foreign nations? For instance, I'm thinking here about Afghanistan. We know that Afghanistan has always had a role in the production of drugs being spread all around the world and probably even China. So does the raw material start from Asia and get to Mexico? How does it work?
Well, at the moment, most of the chemicals used to make fentanyl in Mexico continue to come from China, the vast bulk of it. I'm sure some comes from India as well. But most of it comes from China, but they're industrial chemicals. And there have been a lot of moves to ban or to limit the importation or the exportation of these chemicals from China. Over time, the Chinese government has done some things to cooperate. But one of the challenges is the drug cartels in Mexico, they hire PhD chemists from the Mexican universities. So
Wow.
if law enforcement attempts to ban, a certain chemical from coming in from China, well, there are chemists who are capable of synthesizing that chemical. And it'll increase the cost of production. But the challenge with synthetic chemicals, it's like fentanyl and methamphetamine, is almost impossible to eradicate the source chemicals. You can try to burn down cocaine fields, you can try to burn down poppy fields, but it's very difficult in the modern world to really clamp down on the movement of industrial chemicals. And that's why this is proving to be such an intractable challenge. They're using more or less commonly obtained chemicals, and they're making more profit than anybody's ever made in history. And we have a giant population of people in the United States who wants it. And it's not just here, it's spreading to Europe. I'm reading anecdotally that fentanyl is showing up in Europe. And I do predict that Europe's going to have a big problem in a few years because fentanyl is so inexpensive. And I met a young homeless guy in San Francisco living on the street, no source of income. He told me he uses fentanyl 20 times a day. And he said with a little bit of income that he gets from the public welfare sources or he steals or whatever else he does, he's able to get enough fentanyl to use it 20 times a day.
So how do you explain that Europe so far doesn't have such a big problem? Because as you say, it's arriving, and every once in a while you also hear about fentanyl here in Italy, for instance. But don't tell me that the reason is that we don't have drug dealers, because that's not the case. And China's not that far away from Europe. I mean, it's halfway between us and you guys if you go east instead of going west. So how come Europe is lagging behind? I mean, this is of course nothing to be proud of, and the later the better in this case. But what's the difference?
Well, it's interesting. Many people here in the United States will compare American drug policy to drug policy in Iceland or Portugal or Finland. We hear about this all the time. Well, in Finland, they do it this way. Well, they also do the schools very differently in Finland because they have a different culture in Finland. So it's my opinion that the much of the problem comes from current American culture. And I believe we have a culture that where the strength of the family has diminished. There's lots of, it's a complicated conversation, but there's lots of things
Sure.
going on in the American population, and we still allow the popular culture to promote drug use. I don't think Italy allows pharmaceutical companies to advertise on TV, but there are times of the day in the United States where every commercial on TV is for a prescription drug or over-the-counter medicine. So our entire, and that started roughly 2001, 2002. And so for the last 2 decades, anyone growing up in the United States has grown up on a steady diet of advertising that chemicals are the solution to your problems. And so I
Okay.
don't necessarily blame a 15-year-old in the United States who has been raised on propaganda that a pharmaceutical pill will solve the problems to be a little more susceptible than they should be to thinking that maybe that drug their friend's offering them will also solve some problem they have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And how is the DEA and other agencies, I guess the FBI is involved as well, trying to tackle this?
Well, they're not trying to tackle a culture. I mean, that's kind of my
Of
big complaint.
course.
I mean, the nature of drug trafficking has changed. The drugs are so easy to produce now in such massive quantities that I think it's a tectonic shift in how law enforcement needs to deal with it. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a lot of efficiency in stopping the massive amount coming in, because it's just a different reality now. But the efforts that DEA makes and that FBI makes and that the United States government makes to educate about drug abuse and prevent the consumption are minimal.
Mhm.
They're minimal. And there's a famous program called the DARE program that was here in the United States. It started in the 80s and it was in the schools, and police officers would go in and educate kids about drug abuse. And eventually, some social scientists said, you know what? DARE doesn't do anything. DARE doesn't make a difference. And so DARE was pushed out of the schools 15 or 20 years ago. DARE was eliminated from the schools. I'm not defending DARE. I don't know that DARE had great value or not. For me, the problem is DARE wasn't replaced. The United States didn't say, okay, we don't like DARE, so we're going to invent a new program, a better program, and educate our population. So as overdose death has gone from 10,000 a year when I started in DEA to almost 10,000 a month, we have not reinstituted in a national way, in a big way, drug prevention education. And it's what I do now. So I retired from DEA 3 years ago. I work for the County of San Diego school system. And I spend all my time going into schools saying, hey, kids, let's talk. You can choose to use this stuff. You're being told by all sorts of people it's going to be great. It's going to make you a better human being. But let's look at the real consequences in real people. And I get a really great reaction from the kids because they're not getting that guidance from anywhere else.
And how does the drug sneaking or drug dealing fighting against drug dealing and then drug sneaking work?
Well, you mean on the border?
Either way, I mean, I think I would
Yeah,
say even at the border and at the street level.
so when I started in DEA, the drug cartels in Mexico did not have a big footprint in the United States. I mean, they would get the drugs across the border, and then it was mostly domestic drug dealers in the United States that would handle the distribution. But for more than 20 years, the cartels have moved their operatives into Chicago, into Atlanta, into Los Angeles. And so the drug comes in from Mexico by the cartels. It's warehoused clandestinely in the United States by the cartels. And the bulk distribution is handled by the cartels. And then it gets down to, the neighborhood and the city distribution, and that's where the local drug dealers get involved. And the cartels know about law enforcement techniques. So every time the DEA or the FBI or Homeland Security does something innovative with investigations, the first time it's used in a judicial process in a court, all the other drug dealers know this is now what law enforcement can do. So they adapt and they stay ahead of us, and they have more money than we do, and they're profit driven. So it's every time law enforcement in the United States tries to advance their investigative techniques against the cartels change their technology and their methodology, or they move their people. So if I'm in San Diego and I'm investigating you because I think you're the local distributor, maybe 6 months from now you're gone. They've just moved you, and now you've been replaced by somebody I've never heard of before. So DEA is doing great work. I mean, law enforcement is doing great work, and I'm really valuing what they do. The problem I see is that the challenge has gotten much, much bigger, and we don't seem willing to acknowledge that. And again, if we're not going to address the demand side, if we're not going to talk about and do something about the millions of Americans who want to buy and use this stuff, then are we ever actually going to be successful at stopping it from coming across the border?
Okay, I'm having the impression while you speak, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this phenomenon is more concentrated at the south, because being closer to Mexico, probably it's easier to find this. No, it's everywhere.
No, 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 no. That's absolutely
Okay,
incorrect. It's everywhere.
okay,
The distribution's everywhere. So their networks distribute across the entire United States.
okay.
Yeah. No, and so if the bigger drug seizures, the biggest drug seizures happen at the border, or they'll happen in Atlanta or in Los Angeles, because that's where the tractor trailer truck is bringing, 1 million pills. But once it gets to Los Angeles, then it's distributed by the thousands and pushed out across America. There's nowhere in America that's free from this. I've taught in very, very small rural communities, and it's there in places you don't want to see it. You don't want to think it's there. It's there. And then, of course, the internet makes it really easy for people actually to order it through the parcel services, and that's a huge problem we have. So a lot of the drug distribution going on inside the United States is happening through the parcel services. It comes in from Mexico and somebody takes it to a parcel delivery service and they send it out in small amounts. And there's no inspection on these packages. And it's if law enforcement, if I catch you in your town with 100 fentanyl pills, right? You may not even be able to tell me where you bought it because you ordered it off
Yeah,
some
okay.
website and you used some kind of cryptocurrency or some kind of untraceable financial method to purchase it.
Okay, so instead of buying from my gangster close by, I can buy it on the dark web or on Telegram, on something like that, and have it delivered wherever I want.
Absolutely. And it's a big challenge right now. The social media companies, Instagram, Snapchat, terrible problem because the drug dealers are on those websites. And there's a big argument. A lot of families whose kids have died from overdose, their children bought the drugs that killed them off of the people from the social media sites. So there's a huge conflict right now, and people are suing these social media companies. They're trying to get the social media companies to do more to block the drug trafficking. DEA is working with the social media companies, trying to share information. But the reality is, if someone in the United States, even a child, wants to get the drug, they're going to find someone locally to sell to them, or without much difficulty, they can find somebody online that will deliver it to them.
Well, let me ask you a question that might sound dumb, but would the guy selling it via website be the same person who sells it on the street?
No,
No, it's two different businesses.
two different animals. Yeah.
Okay.
In my experience, I'm not to say there's never, but typically it's two different methodologies of operating.
What suggestion would you give authorities, if any, to try and tackle or at least to water this phenomenon down?
Well, it's interesting. As a law enforcement officer for 30 years, I believe in law enforcement, but I'm feeling a little hopeless about it at the moment. So all of my advice is on education. I think
Yeah.
every kid in Italy deserves to understand the truth about this. It doesn't take a lot of time to give a kid the basic warnings. But in the United States and I think many other countries, we're not even trying. I was at DEA has an international drug conference, a worldwide conference every year. And I don't know, 2018 or something, I was at the conference in the Dominican Republic. And the next year was going to be in Holland and the Netherlands. And I went to the organizers from the Netherlands and I said, look, I would love to come teach at your conference?" And they said, "Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah," and they never did. And I talked later, and people said, "Yeah, they don't think drug consumption is a big problem in the Netherlands." Right? So it's an attitude in the authority. Of course, it's a problem in the Netherlands, and it's an attitude in
Absolutely.
the authorities. And thank God it's not as bad in the Netherlands yet as it is here. But still, I think where we're failing across the globe is in addressing the demand side and the cultural side.
Okay. Well, Rocky, many thanks for your time and for your very precious explanations. I think that this topic is very interesting and people have to be aware. And I think that you gave all my viewers a very detailed explanation about all this thing work from the first stages to the final consumption. So I think that this explanation, this insight that you gave us is very useful.
Well, my pleasure.
Thanks everybody else for watching this video and see you all in my next episode. Bye bye.